The greatest works of art create artists. For many, many months, I have been researching the history of Thomas and Friends fan content on YouTube. Why on earth Thomas and Friends fan content exists in the first place could be its own video, but it suffices to say that the Reverend Audrey's Railway Series books and the early years of the TV show have created not just a fan base, but an army of writers, animators, essayists, and so much more through their charm, surprising maturity, and pure craft. Particularly from the early 2000s, a community of adult Thomas fans has been growing. An unlikely fandom, but also a dedicated and talented one. This video is going to cover that fandom's achievements in a way that I haven't seen done anywhere else. From the earliest fan projects that were made before I was born, right up to the present day, this is the history of Thomas and Friends fan content. If you want to skip to the timeline itself, then go to the timestamp on screen. That said, I think a few disclaimers are in order before we begin. Firstly, this video focuses mostly on original stories written by the fandom over the years, although we'll be looking at some music and other stuff along the way too. This video is dedicated to us adult talking train people though, so I won't be highlighting clips which have 17 million views but are just some kid playing with a train set. Secondly, this video is YouTube focused. There is no way I could cover all the amazing projects that people have modelled, filmed and orchestrated over the years, so there will be stuff left out. That said, this is not just a quick overview, and if you're watching this after the premiere, you'll be able to see that from the runtime. I want to cover as many amazing projects as I can, because our history on this site isn't just a dozen epic films, it's 20 dozen epic films with thousands and thousands of smaller projects that deserve to be covered with at least a fraction of the time that went into making them. There's also the fact that by going through a lot of projects rather than just a couple, it makes it easier for you, the viewer, to see trends over time more clearly. If you feel this video is way too long for what it covers, I couldn't care less. If you feel I've actually missed out something important though, then go and comment. Tell us what your favourite Thomas content on the platform is, and why. I want this video to get some real discussion going, not just in our circles, but beyond the fandom as well. For many people, Thomas the Tank Engine fandom is, perhaps understandably, an immediate turn-off, because it just sounds ludicrous, but I don't want it to stay that way. The fans of this show and book series have used it as a medium to create things that I think would stun the outside world if they gave us a chance. Finally, I won't be going into too much drama on this timeline, and believe me, there's been plenty. When I do rarely mention the personal lives of real individuals, I'm going to be keeping it brief and as unbiased as possible. With all of those caveats out the way, let's rewind the clock to a simpler time. Where we're going, nobody has heard of COVID-19, TikTok, or All Engines Go. Nobody has even heard of YouTube. In the year 2000, Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends had been airing on TV for 16 years, and it was already an international sensation. I'm sure that on those grainy cameras of the 90s, some children somewhere shot clips of their Thomas sets, but no footage like that has ever really surfaced. No, our timeline properly begins in early 2000, when the Northside Camcorder Club of Sydney, Australia, decided to hold a short film competition for the end of the year. One of the members of this club was pyrotechnician Leo Henry, and looking for a way to work miniatures and explosives into his film entry, he stumbled across the UNTOLD Thomas range, which he decided to use in his project. Now, Leo wasn't very familiar with Thomas as seen on TV, but he thought the merchandise was perfect for what he had in mind. He drafted up a script, renamed most of the engines, and began work on filming the Mad Bomber Rolling Stock. Even though the Mad Bomber was more or less the first digital production to use Thomas to tell a proper story, it wasn't really a Thomas story. It took the characters, changed them up, blew them up in fact, and used them as a medium to create a really high quality, professional piece of work. You couldn't tell from watching it that this was filmed on a tight budget in the tight spaces of a garage. Production took 8 months, and it was shown to the Camcorder Club at the end of the year. But YouTube wasn't a thing at this point, and Leo had no plans for a sequel, so the only people who knew about Mad Bomber were the club members themselves. And so the world waited, none the wiser. A whole year later, in December 2001, a little game was released, Trains Community Edition. Previously just a set of downloadable files, the official launch of this railway simulator was one of the most important events in the history of the Thomas fandom, and it would go on to become the main platform used for creating fan stories in the decades to come. Although there were some early contenders like Microsoft Train Simulator, they were really very short-lived in comparison. At this point, Trains wasn't very customizable though, so no Thomas stories could be made with it just yet. But the stage was still being set. The same thing could be said of Sodor Island Forums, an internet forum site created another year later on the 4th of December 2002. Although the site had to be relaunched a few years after this and has become a bit quieter than it was a few years ago, it's still a great place to chat with fellow adult Thomas fans. Back in 2002 though, the reason this forum was important was because it provided a place where Thomas content could be shared. Fan dubs, audio productions, art, the whole works. One of the most important types of content on the site was, and still is, the Extended Railway series, a fan project that continues the timeline of Audrey's books with many great contributions. Early 2003 saw the first ERS story, and hundreds more have been produced since. We'll see later down the line that the Extended Railway series provided a foundation for some pretty significant YouTube adaptations. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The next important event came along in September 2003, with the release of the confusingly titled Trains Railroad Simulator 2004. The key thing about this edition of the game was that it allowed outside content to be uploaded into the simulator, and this gave Thomas fans the tools to make adaptations or original stories with the characters that they knew. At the end of 2004, a user called MST Noodle began to release the first proper Thomas models for Trains. But at least for now, they were a real hassle to download, and they weren't too well known about. Again though, that was soon to change. 2005 rolls round, and oh boy, what a year. On the 14th of February, YouTube was founded. Although it would really start to explode in popularity a bit later, even from its earliest moments, Thomas was having an influence on it. The first ever Thomas-related video was uploaded on November the 24th by the channel Courtenay, entitled Train Accident. It was followed by the much more famous Thomas the Train at Tomy Toy Fair on December 22nd, which has stolen its crown a bit. Although neither of these were original content by the fandom proper, they are important bits of history, and so I decided to include them nonetheless. Before we leave 2005 though, one last thing. There is still stuff going on in the background, away from YouTube. A user who would join YouTube the next year, Captain Punjab, was beginning to work on silent films with the Bachman merchandise range. Although the early days of their channel are shrouded in mystery and the first episode of their series is lost to time, it was probably uploaded to YouTube sometime in 2006 from another video hosting website. Speaking of 2006, that year saw a few more significant standalone videos by the growing online Thomas community. Thomas the Bad Engine #1 was made by a guy called Bill Barman when he was sick one day in October. Perilous Zed gave us one of Thomas's first 3D animated appearances in November's Thomas Conquers the Hill, and December saw the iconic Laughing Tomy Trains video by Thomas Tank Boys. Fearless Freddy 234, now known as Joey Turner, was also contributing a lot of popular Tomy work, now in the millions of views despite pretty low quality, and I don't say that to belittle it. The reason I'm moving through this year so quickly is because that's what the content here was like. Short. Even the most popular members of the community back then didn't have the tools we have now, unless they were Leo Henry, who had movie industry experience. It was around this time, and into 2007, that the Sodor Island fan site began pursuing interviews with members of the show's original cast, starting with Michael Brandon of narration fame. The fact that links were being made with the cast and crew of the show itself definitely shows an explosion of growth between 2000 and 2006. This is further evidenced by the creation of the show's wiki on March 16th, which is still going strong today and is the main hotspot for info on all things Thomas. Remember Mad Bomber? Well, on February the 4th, 2007, it hit YouTube on Leo Henry's new channel, Leo Kim Video. Now, it wasn't an instant success, but by the next year it would have hundreds of thousands of views as adult Thomas fans, and plenty of children too of course, found out what was possible using this medium. For a way more in-depth look at the history of the Mad Bomber in general, which also goes into the sequel we didn't quite get, I'd recommend watching Ben 10 Life's retrospective. It's really thorough. Suffice to say that although the sequel never came to fruition due to practical issues and fears of a copyright strike, Leo Kim Video has gone on to be an incredibly successful channel, which still has a lot of Thomas merchandise content and well over 1 million subscribers. But who was the Mad Bomber? Who was responsible for all that carnage? Well, we did find out. About 14 years later, so that's an incentive to watch to the end of this. 2007 was really the year when people started making Thomas series. The projects we've talked about so far have generally been standalone, but this year, episodic fan creations were becoming the thing. The first major one was by Sparkshots, also known at the time as Knucklehead Productions. This series was The Railways of Sodor, which was filmed a bit earlier than this, but had its first 6 episodes uploaded onto YouTube in February. It utilised the Hornby range, and in its creators' words, part of the aim was to capture the Season 1 style of the original show. After a very simple pilot, it quickly went off in some unexpected directions, with irreverent humour and a mutant caterpillar. The spring of 2007 saw some of the first Thomas Trains content being uploaded, including pretty much the earliest piece I could find, a really ancient music video for Accidents Will Happen, on March the 10th. Later that spring, Captain Punjab released episode 2 of his Thomas the Backman model series, one of only 3 episodes that survive to this day, out of the 12 filmed. Although it's frankly a really weird and not very connected series, with Darth Vader showing up at one point, the key thing is that it used the Backman range rather than Sparkshot's Hornby stuff. Hornby's Thomas merch goes all the way back to 1985, but Backman had only started making HO scale Thomas characters in 2002, so these were new, fresh models that took the fandom by storm. Miss Oliver and Blossom's series was much the same, and again is slightly surreal to watch nowadays. Both of these creators were pillars of the early community, and Miss Oliver and Blossom enjoyed some real success, with a few of their old episodes now in the millions of views. But the most influential project of 2007 was actually another standalone creation, by the user Bulgy13, Thomas Blows His Stack. If you're part of the adult Thomas fandom, you'll almost certainly have heard of this one. It actually has more views than Mad Bomber does, and in a way, that's what it modelled itself after. Diesel 10 corrupts Thomas, and he tries to kill a bunch of his friends in cartoony fashion. Although it was only made for an assignment, the comments aren't wrong when they say that it was quite ahead of its time. Now, it's not the most polished production, certainly nowhere near Mad Bomber, but that's the point. The reason this video is so remembered, I think, is because it was a Mad Bomber at home in the best kind of way. It showed that you didn't need to be a pyrotechnician to create something that would be popular. Also, I hope you notice a theme beginning to emerge in many of these projects. Whether it's Sparkshot's blunt dialogue, or Punjab's Darth Vader, or the dark satire of Mad Bomber and Thomas Blows His Stack, there was already a large proportion of the fanbase that wanted to take Thomas and twist it to their own ends. They wanted to take the relative innocence of the TV show and make it darker, different, and more versatile. That's not to say every project did this, absolutely not. There were still tons of classic remakes, and the first arrangements of classic themes were beginning to appear as well. But my point is that fan creations that tried to make the show something very different didn't start with Shed 17. It was there from the beginning. The Hood classic Thomas and the Killer Cars became a viral video upon its release on August the 14th, just 3 minutes long and made for a young family member of the creator. Although it's not exactly a hallmark of fandom ingenuity, it would be remiss of me not to mention it. Something that is a hallmark of fandom ingenuity, and really underrated, premiered 3 days later with Simon A.C. Martin's British Railway Stories series, focused on original characters from the UK mainland. In recent years, parts of this series have actually been published in book form, and even though they aren't Thomas stories, they were clearly a spiritual successor to the Railway series in the mind of their creator. This is also the first series I can find that really leans into the idea of using real railway history to tell a good story, just like Audrey did. History was also made on August 28th, with Ozrail Animations uploading a clip of a 3D CGI Thomas with facial movement. The reason this is so cool is because it shows just how innovative Thomas was pushing people to be. The show itself hadn't gone CGI at this point, and so the fact that people based at home were already doing this kind of thing with nowhere near the programs we have today is pretty mind-blowing. And this still looks better than Season 12. As we move towards the end of 2007, let's take a moment to talk about remakes, which I already mentioned a little bit. Using audio from the show and recreating the visuals with merchandise began to become a real trend right about now, since more people had proper editing software and a larger range of merch to work with. Some of the earliest popular remakes come from Thomas Collector, who worked in Take Along, and Percy Engine 619, who made Tomy remakes. While it might be tempting to look down on these as just worse versions of TV episodes, I think that's a real mistake. They gave a lot of creators a way to get used to filming with physical models, and the tradition has persisted to the present day, with some pretty incredible results. It laid the groundwork for a lot of early projects too, such as our final entry for 2007, Thomas the Model Movie by Combine Harvester 01, a sort of half Magic Railroad rehash that was actually quite ambitious, split up into 7 parts and about an hour long. Although it'll be a while before we start getting proper, high-quality movies from the fandom, it's interesting to note that not everything was about series and episodes back in the old days. 2008 was a continuation of the 2007 style, and not much new stuff was invented. Shepper Studios was a channel that thrived on Bachman content this year, really carving a niche for itself, and Tencent's 01 began to bring Wooden Railway onto the remake scene, as well as the first ancestor of the Thomas YouTube poop, Gordon Uses Foul Language. The channel Thomas Wooden Railway, as well as joining in with the remake trend, released their first ever Wooden Railway collection video this year, and along with other ones from a couple of smaller channels, this was the start of a new format. But the real action of 2008 happened in April with the start of 2 new Thomas channels. The first was one that would go on to be an absolute Goliath in the fandom, Diesel D199. The famous Tomica series began with a prologue on April 12th and never really looked back. The second important channel this year launched its biggest series just 2 days later, Realm of Fools Thomas the Trackmaster engine. The Trackmaster range was still hot off the press of its 2007 launch, and Realm of Fool took advantage of this and built a real following, despite being very young like many of these creators at the time. Take a second to note, by the way, that already we've seen stories made with Ertel, Bachman, Hornby, Tomy, Wooden Railway, Trackmaster, and the list goes on. Because Thomas's merchandise had so many ranges, there was also a real range in the feel of these early stories, which is something that was brilliant for fan content in the long run because it stopped there being a mould or a strictly defined expectation that people naturally fell into. There were trends, of course, like the remakes and collection videos we've discussed, but right from the start, creativity was rewarded. Some projects in 2008 were entirely unseen at the time. Most notably, a 15-year-old called Michael Evans was busy filming The Secret Island, a 4-part Ertel stop-motion movie. Although it wouldn't be uploaded to YouTube for some time, it's a good demonstration of how stuff is always going on behind the scenes. That's one of the reasons this video can never be complete. Most of the dates I'm working with here are upload dates, and the months or even years of work that go into fan projects before their release is just skipped over. But I digress. 2008 also saw the continuation of content on trains, not least in the start of a series called Sodor Railways by Shunter Productions, a channel that has come a long way since its beginnings, but uploaded its first trains video, Skarloey the Little Engine, on May 7th. Other trains creators were around, but Shunter Productions was one of the most consistent, with 9 trains uploads across the second half of the year. Other than that, the last few months of 2008 were very, very quiet, and I found almost nothing of note from this chunk of time. But something was about to happen in the world of trains. Something that would revolutionize Thomas content, and perhaps the biggest thing to ever happen to Thomas on YouTube. While the oldest trains models are shrouded in mystery, there are only 2 things you really need to know about them. Number 1, many of them, and probably the best ones, were made by MST Noodle, who we mentioned earlier. And number 2, they were nearly all uploaded onto a site called UKBL, UK Branch Lines. However, in mid-2008, Noodle had been getting annoyed that people were taking his models, reskinning them, and refusing to credit him. In response to this, he asked UKBL to remove all of his models from their site, with the last ones being withdrawn on the 28th of January 2009. This left the growing, but still quite embryonic, trains community with a real problem. However, there was a man who stepped into the breach at this moment. A man called Richard, and better known to many as Scarlowy123. Now, as I've been producing this video, some deeply troubling news about Richard has emerged, and it turns out he's frankly a disgusting individual. I don't want to be too quick to say, let's just separate the art from the artist, and it really is tragic that the creators of wonderful stories can be so terrible themselves. If anything, their own art mocks them. So I refuse to feel bad talking about that art itself, beginning with Sodor Island 3D. Scarlowy123 founded Sodor Island 3D on January the 31st, 2009, and with the help of a few collaborators, he picked up where UKBL had left off. Before even one day had passed, there were already videos on YouTube using the SI3D model of James. More models were added over time, and before long, SI3D was the go-to for free-to-use Thomas models in trains. I cannot overstate what this site did. It didn't just save the trains community, it also brought tons of people into the trains community from the outside, and inspired others to try their hands at digital model making too. For now, the site supported models for Trains 2006 only, but that was soon to change. SI3D, while incredibly significant, shouldn't distract us from other amazing stuff that happened at the start of this year too. On the same day that the last of MST Noodle's models vanished from UKBL, that being January the 28th, Cactus 190706 began uploading a Bachmann series called Sodor Railways, and yes, that is a very similar name to Sparkshot's earlier series. In fact, this became a trend while researching this video, and it made my life very difficult, I can tell you, to be up to my eyes in 50 different series called Sodor the Early Tales and Stories of the Northwestern Railway series Legacy Modernization Series North. Thanks, guys. Cactuses was only the first prominent series this year, as it was followed on March the 11th by the start of Thomas Wooden Railway's first season, the first of over 260 episodes. May the 2nd saw something similar come from Milk Tanker Media, whose work is probably less renowned but just as praiseworthy. Both of these users, along with others like Clarty34, really show that the king this year was Wooden Railway content. Wooden Railway was very different to the other ranges available, because it mixed real movement with accessibility. Hornby and Bachmann took money, time and space to set up really properly, but Wooden Railway had a large cast of 60 or so characters by this point, and was just easy to pick up and film with. It was around this time, on April the 29th, that one of the first ever fandom-wide creative events was announced, Leo Kim Video's Mad Bomber video competition. Anyone could enter a 40-second clip that fit within the context of Leo's now classic project Rolling Stock, and receive free merch and even original props from Mad Bomber as prizes. With the planned sequel to the first installment of Mad Bomber in the works at this time, and everyone hyped beyond belief, this was a big community event which saw 88 video submissions. It's actually a really nice way to see just how far the fandom had come since Mad Bomber had been uploaded back in 2007. There were train submissions on giant sets, Miss Oliver and Blossom showed up, and there were sets with live fire. This event really brought people together, and it probably made different sections of the community even more aware of what others were doing. There was one entry though, by Richard of Scarlowy123. The creator of SI3D did participate in the Mad Bomber competition, winning 3rd place, but that was nothing compared to his passion project this year. Again, if you know anything about Thomas on YouTube, chances are you've heard of this one. The first episode of the 3-parter Sodor Dark Times dropped on June 24th, with the next episodes following across the next 2 months. This trilogy was a huge inspiration for many projects in the future, and it was also the next big step on the alternative take timeline. It reimagined Sodor as a much bleaker, more action-driven world, and like Mad Bomber or Thomas Blows' Stack, it ignored the established canon in favour of excitement and tension. It also introduced Alfred, a take on the Railway series' unnamed character 98462. Alfred would go on to be used in countless other videos, probably becoming the most famous original character in the fandom, although there's a contender for that title that we'll meet later. Sodor Dark Times was a hard act to follow. The rest of 2009 passed largely without incident. SI3D continued exploding in popularity, and everyone reflected and discussed the future of Mad Bomber and Dark Times, some probably happier than others at the direction the fandom was taking. The extended railway series over on SIF was also overhauled this summer, a lot of material rewritten, and a new timeline drafted up that has lasted to the present day. This is the point where the number of creators really booms, and I can't cover even 2% of them. 2009 was a real year of community, of wooden railway, of trains, and most of all, of growth. At some mysterious point around the turn of 2010, a guy named John created his first YouTube account, Trainboy54. He made some content crossing Thomas and Phineas and Ferb, and he attracted some attention. Although this channel would go on to be removed, his story isn't over yet, so just keep him in the back of your mind. 2010 can be summed up in one word, for me at least: nostalgia. The stuff made this year is the content I remember best from childhood, and was my first exposure to Thomas on YouTube as a kid. On January 17th, for example, Michael Evans of ThomasFan8 released Jeopardy, a movie in 3 parts which saw Thomas discover an abandoned volcanic island off the coast of Sodor. This film got a really good response, a much better one than the response to another island-centric film that came out shortly after. Michael really cultivated a nice homegrown feel with this project. It had some pretty advanced camera movements and made good use of stop motion and animated eyes, but also had a really authentic vibe. April 23rd saw the release of another movie split into parts in the same style as ThomasFan8's content, but probably working on a slightly smaller budget. This film was The 6 Vanishing Engines by Bramgrove Films, who would also go on to make some pretty viral videos in trains. 6 Vanishing Engines, though, was a continuation of Magic Railroad, adapting a fairy tale from the Brothers Grimm. Jumping back a couple of months, on February 14th this year, a tiny channel uploaded a video called Peter Sam's Predicament. It was uploaded by Tynes Senseth. Huh, weird name. Oh well, it barely got any views. That's a shame. I guess we'll never hear from him again. Thomas-themed comedy was now an established subgenre, if that's not too grand a term for 30-second YouTube poops. In these early days, the most high-effort Thomas memes were songs like WLT Network's Breakfast Song. Although it would be easy to write this off as a pointless addition in our timeline, it does show a diversity of content in this era. Another unusual vein of content emerged on May 28th, with the release of the first Transformers episode, a parody web series by experienced animator James Farr. Like Leo Henry before him, Farr wasn't really part of the fandom to begin with, but having a Thomas-obsessed child, he took the plunge and created an internet legend. The older episodes, including this first one, would later be taken down by HIT for copyright infringement, but not before they had gained a sizable following from fans of both Thomas and Transformers. In July, SI3D moved from Trains 2006 to Trains 2009, and gave many of their models a so-called baked look. The site continued strong, however, and the amount of Trains productions continued to shoot up. But our final entry for 2010 isn't a Trains production, but rather a Bachmann one. September 8th saw the first episode of Jimmy the Ginty uploaded by DCG-12B. This series begins on the Northwestern Railway, but cleverly uses that familiar setting to set up the main series, which takes place in Euston on the mainland, and follows Jimmy the Ginty and his friends. Although projects like this weren't as flashy as those in 2009 had been, they were important, and we'll get a chance later to look back and see just how far some of these series went. But now, 2011. There are very few train series that can claim to have been going on for over a decade, but Sodor the Early Years, a series by Wild Nor'Wester that would morph into Sodor the Modern Years, is one such example. On February the 5th of 2011, the first episode hit YouTube, and this, I would say this was really the start of Trains content on YouTube. Of course, there had been influential projects before this one, most obviously Dark Times, but in terms of proper, extended series, it seems to me that this was the year Trains took top spot for sheer volume of content. Wild Nor'Wester's work also mirrors, rather nicely, the progression of Trains content as a whole, It starts off very simple, but even in just its first couple of years, the quality increases leaps and bounds, sort of mushrooming out into a developed world which played with backstory and varied tones in a way that wasn't super common before this point. Dark Times was amazing, but it was all, well, pretty dark. What Wild Nor'Wester did, at least after a bit, was really hit on the power of variety. It wasn't just the stories either, as he went on to enjoy considerable popularity for his own Trains modelling work. Now, that's a lot of Trains talk, but 2011 wasn't entirely a digital year. In fact, probably the most famous wooden railway series of all time had its origins in June this year, with the release of Enterprising Engines Episode 1, Lift Bridge. Although a much more polished, updated version would be made sometime later, Matt over at Enterprising Engine 9.3's first episode was filmed with a camcorder in his bedroom and didn't prepare anyone for how loved and cinematic the series would one day become. Remember John over at Trainboy54? Well, on August 12th, he showed up again after a channel termination, on a new channel called, appropriately, The New Trainboy54. I'm going to go over pretty much all the Trainboy stuff now, so that it doesn't clog up the timeline later. It was a saga that went on for years. So, to summarise, Trainboy54 was a huge influence on a lot of younger viewers for quite a few years. His most famous brand of content was crossovers, specifically between Thomas and Phineas and Ferb, typically using Phineas and Ferb plots but tacking Thomas characters on top of them. Now, this attracted the attention of people beyond the fandom, who sadly harassed him a ton. He also faced a lot of pretty fair copyright problems, and the history of his various channels is really convoluted, with videos becoming lost and unlost across the years. While very well known, he was criticised for fringe Thomas customs that crossed over with other franchises, having basically no original stories, and some definite plagiarism from other content creators. While all of these things do range from weird to morally dubious, I think we can fairly safely say that Trainboy54 got a disproportionate amount of flack. He kept doing his thing through it all, even to this day, and you've got to respect that, no matter what you think of his content or how it reflects on the fandom. In the latter half of this year, more trains and physical content alike kept pouring in. A channel called TARDIS Rescue was making some high-quality Trains content by this point, experimenting with the style of the Railway series in original stories. August 14th saw one of the most successful, Bright Spark. ThomasFan8 also uploaded the first part of his older project that we mentioned a while back, The Secret Island, onto his second channel in October, with the rest to follow in 2012. These uploads featured new and improved audio and music, and alongside Jeopardy would go on to be huge nostalgia fuel for many years. November saw the first proper YTP by a pioneer of the modern YTP format, Bioko Island Films, as well as the debut of the Railway Inspector 3's series, When the Engines Split. That production featured a voice cast of some very familiar faces and many pillars of the community. ThomasFan8 also had the parting shot of the year, with Thomas and the Christmas Disaster being uploaded on Christmas Day, and really showcasing how much progress his channel had made from his first endeavours. 2012 is next, but it was another year of continuity. A lot of the big series were rumbling on at this point, of course, and we'll catch up with them later, but in terms of really big, fresh projects, 2012 was quite calm. Unless you count Thunderbird Studios' slightly bizarre Thomas's Day Off music mashup, one of the first new projects worthy of note is quite an underrated one, the Barry the Rescue Engine series, its pilot uploaded onto the channel The Adventures of Thomas and Friends on April 10th, after a few copyright problems. This series wasn't talked about very much at the time, and isn't now, but the creator, Christian Brown of ThomasFan247, is a really talented guy who we'll be talking a bit more about later. April 19th, in contrast, saw the beginnings of a series that absolutely was talked about at the time, and has around 200 episodes now in a 14-season run. That series is NWR 1991's Northwestern Railway Tales, and its first episode, Whistle Trouble, was an adaptation of an annual story by Christopher Awdry. Annual stories were actually fairly popular around this time as things to adapt, because they weren't stories that everyone in the fandom knew off by heart, but they were still stories that fit the feel of Thomas and gave creators an easy way to practice their skills. Wooden railway content was still the king of the castle this year though. Enterprising Engines finished a successful first season in April, and already you can see just how far Matt came from Lift Bridge. Milk Tanker Media was also going strong with original storylines, including a 2-hour feature film, An Engine Abroad, releasing on August 31st. And what better way to end this section of Wood and Pixels than with a video that combined them, the famous A Toy Train in Space, uploaded on September 20th, 2012. While not really a Thomas fandom project, the efforts of this one dad to send his son's wooden railway Stanley into the stratosphere were so admirable that they even prompted a merchandise item 5 years later. It really shows the impact YouTube can have on the brand itself, and is a wholesome way to wrap up these years of development. In just 4 years, the fandom had gone from having most of its trains models struck out of existence to thousands of complex projects on layouts and screens across the world. Thomas had well and truly found its footing, and a golden age was ahead. But wait, just a second there. Look, I've said a few times already that there were so many amazing people creating content at this time. There are a couple of others that I just have to give brief mentions to, because they were doing things around this point, and if you're interested in further research, by which I mean an excuse to watch Thomas videos on YouTube, you might want to check out their work from this time period. And so, in its first instalment for 2009 to 2012, welcome to the Honourable Mentions Zone. For these few years, our Honourable Mentions are Clarity34, The Blue E2, Fantastic Mr. S, A Young Caleb Train, Streaking Steam Productions, now known as Wardleton Productions, The Charnwood Forest Railway, and Siramai. Alright, now we can move on to that golden age I was talking about. Early 2013 saw some new channels upload their first videos, and wow are these some big names. January 12th saw Thomas 1, Edward 2, Henry 3's, aka Henry the Green Engine Productions, first upload, a Trains remake of Toby's Discovery. From this point on, I'm just going to be calling them T1E2H3, because we'd all like this video to be under 5 hours long. Our second newcomer of importance was Jeremy Crispo on January 31st, beginning another train-centric channel with a video simply called Wrecker James, complete with an out-of-pocket crash right at the end of it. Some more normal videos would follow, and today Jeremy's channel has 370 million accumulated views. Ever heard of a guy called Carson? That's right, Carson's Video Workshop had its beginnings early this year as well, with an intro template for Trains videos uploaded on March 23rd. If that heavyweight of the Trains community wasn't enough for you, here's another. Nathan of I Love Trains 323 uploaded his first episode of Thomas the Train's Adventures on April 8th. Even though Nathan's channel had been around before this point, this was the beginning of another Trains series that would go on to attract fandom-wide attention. That list of 4, T1E2H3, Jeremy Crispo, Carson and Nathan, really sums up 2013. It really was a year of Trains innovation, and while lots of physical projects were still going strong in the background, it's fair to say that by this point, when people thought of Thomas fan content, they thought of the Train Simulator. This was only solidified by T1E2H3 series The Engines of Sodor, which debuted on June 13th and went on for over 5 years, with specials and a prequel series that we'll give a mention later. T1E2H3 also worked in some other forms over the years, like Wooden Railway and even YouTube Poops, but in terms of impact, his Trains content probably did the most. While this year was dominated by Trains, there are 2 exceptions to this rule that really deserve to be talked about. First of all, the music scene had exploded by this point. Mario Paint composer rearrangements of Thomas themes were a big thing, and new and rising artists were joining the ranks all the time. By this point, you had creators like MK the Instrumentalist, Sudrian Afro Music began his classic recreations around this time, and a channel called Burnison, later the Tugster Intensifies, was also moving into this field. I think the musical talent of this fandom is perhaps one of its most unsung achievements, if you'll pardon the pun. All the channels I've just mentioned, and more, weren't just contributing to the community by making their own stuff, they were contributing to the community by letting people use their stuff. The content of these years would not have been nearly as engaging without the soundtracks provided by these channels. The second exception to Trains' mastery of 2013 came in the form of the Craziest Crash contest, announced by one Caleb Train when he hit 1,000 subscribers around July 31st. This competition brought a bunch of creators together in a Mad Bomber contest style event, which was all about filming the most inventive accidents possible. As well as being a cool bit of history, it's also a nice way to prove that physical models were alive and well this year. Notable participants include the Blue E2, Terrier 55 Stepney, Bram Group Films, The Train Modeler, and I Love Trains 323. The winner, however, was Christian of Thomas Fan 247, who stole the show with Thomas crashing into a mirror. Finally for this year, we have GWR Studios, who began his Goof Spotting series on December 2nd, with a video highlighting all the production errors in the show's first episode. This was actually quite an important series, because analysis of the show as a piece of art wasn't really much of a thing on YouTube yet, aside from short reviews of the odd movie, and so this Goof series formed a stepping stone to the video essays and commentary we'll be mentioning a bit later. If 2013 was dominated by trains, 2014 was really defined by 1 month. 1 month of its 12 was absolutely insane, probably the single most cinematic month in the fandom's history. August. We'll cover 2014 generally in a second, but let's do a deep dive on these 31 days that changed the face of Thomas on YouTube. The 1st of August saw another pretty long-running series beginning. It wasn't in trains. No, I'm talking about Sudrian Conflict, a wooden railway series created by the channel Turtles and Thomas. Although, like a fair few people we've covered and will go on to cover, there'd be some pretty regrettable drama around this guy further down the road, as a piece of fan content, Sudrian Conflict was really impressive. Now, I don't really mean the writing, I mean its focus. Sudrian Conflict is set in the post-war period on Sodor, and gives most of its attention to the human figures. While there were series that had done this before, it's really interesting to me. Fan content, by this point, was so varied that the other sides of Sodor besides the railways were being used for stories. This series also used Wooden Railway very loyally, and although Turtles went on to be equally well known for his work with Ertl, I still find Sudrian Conflict his best contribution. Milk Tanker Media was another Wooden Railway creator still going strong, dropping their second feature-length film, Silver Avenger, on August 23rd. But both of these projects, while impressive, were preludes and prologues to the real action of this month, the highlight of this year, and one of the most famous fan projects ever created. I'm talking, of course, about Tynes Sensith's Tobias and the Half Pariah. I skipped over the history of his channel earlier, but Adam Guzik had been building a small following since his first upload a couple of years back. One of the test predecessors to Half Pariah was My Sari, another fan story utilising Alfred, uploaded on New Year's Day 2012. It featured Percy, of all characters, going down a rather dark path, and effectively selling his soul to the devil. But Half Pariah was bigger than that, with multiple trailers and teaser clips, and lasting well over 100 minutes. Of course, I don't want to spoil the whole movie, but it's enough to say that it took Thomas in the sci-fi direction. The movie began with a story from the books, was a faithful adaptation for the first 10 minutes or so, and then went off the rails in an amazing way. Engine transplants, high-speed chases, and bright glowing blue eyes that I'm sure were just an aesthetic choice and had nothing to do with any sort of larger story. It was wonderful. Half Pariah really followed in the tradition of Dark Times, with a brooding tone and subversion of the show's norms, but it did it with so much more nuance and technical skill. Remember, Dark Times was uploaded 5 years previously, and Trains had come a long way in those 5 years. This was the first real film in the fandom's history, in my opinion, because it wasn't just a long project or a big story, it was an actual movie experience. Needless to say, the movie blew up. Its depictions of Toby and Montague became instant classics, and Tynes didn't take long to announce a sequel, Tobias and the Arcane Merchant. Well, while we wait for that to come out, let's talk about 2014 more generally. August was the big month for new cinematic projects, but other less serious things were also gaining a lot of popularity. YTPs got a huge boost this year, both from channels like The Real Xbox Nerd growing in popularity, as well as YouTubers like the aforementioned T1E2H3 making some in addition to their regular content. Speaking of T1E2H3, the first part of his special series, The Search for Smudger, was uploaded on December 20th this year, a fitting end to a year of similarly epic and large-scale projects. Although the character of Alfred was being used all over the place by this point, a challenger to his supremacy approached on January 21st, with KaneFan701's first part of the untold story of Timothy. Based on a creepypasta from a couple of years beforehand, Kane and Thomas Fan Forever began this tragic saga with an account of Timothy's backstory and his transformation into, well, a demon. Even though he wasn't created by this project, Timothy gained all of his popularity here, and before long he was another fandom-famous OC. The series ended on October 26th this year, and it gained Kane Fan a real cult following, though it wouldn't be his last project. By this point, Diesel D199's Tomica series had also really ramped up in popularity, and on May 18th, it took a turn that basically nothing else had until this point. It moved from physical merchandise, which it had been using for years, to CGI. The test clip was just the beginning of this CGI series, and allowed for way more character expression and varied scenarios. Back in the physical realm, though, this year was quite big for Trackmaster, with channels like Mr. Engine 88 and Trackmaster Productions 2016 gaining popularity. Mr. Engine 88's July 5th remake of James's Crash in The Adventure Begins is an example of a complex remake that you wouldn't have seen with Trackmaster a couple of years before this. Other popular remakes were being crafted in HO00 scale by the Train Modeler, including an ambitious remake of The Magic Railroad Chase on August 22nd. Remakes were gaining a quality here that they'd never had before. We're mostly past the days of them simply being audio rips of full classic episodes. But the biggest bombshell of 2015 was what Half Pariah had been to 2014. Again, you've heard of this one, even if you're not in the fandom. It's Shed 17 by Paul's Vids. Uploaded on October 3rd, Shed 17 was like nothing we'd ever seen before. I mean, Dark Times and Half Pariah and Timothy were all edgy takes on the world of Sodor, but this was a bit different. Shed 17 operates around the disturbing premise that Thomas and his friends are, or were, once humans, biofused into the bodies of machines. Thomas himself is not exactly who he thought he was, and I'm not going to show the more sensitive footage on the screen right now, because I'm sure a lot of you were scarred as children by this. While it's certainly not meant to be taken too seriously, this genuine horror show still remains the furthest the fandom has ever pushed this concept, as far as I know. Shed 17 was quite provocative. It was looking for a reaction. This wasn't the nuanced and carefully plotted storytelling of our previous cinematic projects. This was more so, let's put everyone's favourite childhood characters in really, really disturbing circumstances and just see what happens. While this was basically Thomas and Friends body horror, that doesn't diminish the actual quality of the work, which used a simple style to memorable effect. Moving on from biofused snake engines, the music scene continued to grow this year, and musicians from other sites like SoundCloud also joined YouTube. Upside Now was an emerging talent at this point, and he provides a nice link to our next big event, for which he would go on to compose some of the music, that being the Thomas Creator Collective. The Thomas Creator Collective was a series aired by the official Thomas and Friends YouTube channel in honour of the Railway series' 70th anniversary. The goal was to have episodes written, filmed, and scored by fans. It was an opportunity for the adult fandom to help the show reach the actual main target audience, and also an opportunity to just show the world what we could do. The debut, Secrets of the Stolen Crown, launched on the 6th of November 2015, and was contributed to by people like EE93, the Train Modeler, Caleb Train, and many others. Over the series run, which lasted for years, it would also see contributions from Time Censorth, TARDIS Rescue, Thomas Wooden Railway, The Tugster Intensifies, a lot from Diesel D199, the list just goes on forever. A full list can be found on the wiki, and there are so many famous names that you just need to go and read it. The series used a range of merchandise, and at least for now, it was a really great way for the brand to acknowledge the existence of the fandom, something that hadn't been too common in the past. On December the 3rd, T1E2H3 began a prequel series to the engines of Sodor, NWR Origins. Now, it might seem a bit odd that with all we're skipping over, I'm drawing attention to this one, but it shows something pretty important, as well as just being a very popular series that lasted until 2019. It shows that fan series were playing with their own continuities, not just the timeline of the original show. Lots more fan series would do this, most notably Enterprising Engines with his idea of a Season 0, but NWR Origins was actually a pretty early example. Fleshed out alternative universes and alternative takes on Sudrian history were becoming much more common, and this would go on to inspire even more famous works in the future. And now for 2016, one of my favourite years in the whole timeline. I titled this section of the video Glory Days because that's what these years started off. Although 2016 doesn't have one big project that puts all the others to shame or something, or 1 month where everything kicked off, what it represents is beautiful to me. Thomas content was just pouring in, quality was becoming a normality on the bigger channels and quite a few smaller ones. KaneFan701 was still busy this year with Timothy-centric projects, and on March 21st, the sequel Horror on the Kirk Ronan branch line began its YouTube run. This work is a slight exception to what I just said, since it's not necessarily got the most consistent quality, but in terms of holding an audience, The Legend of Timothy had proved to be one of the best, so the sequel was well earned. On May the 12th, Smurfy Dan released the first part of Steaming to Legacy, a fan-made retrospective on Thomas's history, narrated by Enterprising Engine 93. This documentary series went on to cover a lot of ground and is a really good watch. More to the point in terms of this video, it was one big video essay, and if some of the comments are to be believed, it opened a lot of people's eyes, both inside and outside the fandom, to the amazing heritage this show has. That heritage was being added to throughout this year by some creators who had a knack for variety. One example of this was Max over at Terrier55 Stepney, an up-and-coming trains creator who also worked with physical models and vlogs, developing the real flair for varied content that would go on to make his channel so popular in later years. Thomas the Tank Man 111 was likewise splitting time between HO00 work and music arrangements, with some truly underrated piano pieces still up on his channel. On that note, let's take our obligatory moment to talk about music. Francis S. began to upload orchestral material this year, and Toby's Windmill, later known as Mavis M, was well underway producing really accurate recreations of themes from the show, making them one of the go-tos for YouTube remakes and other projects. For a really crazy movie scene recreation, let's go to Wide Square Films, now called Coyote Media, and their August 14th LEGO remake of the Lost Treasures title sequence. They did more LEGO work with Thomas than just this, and made some clips that are really impressive when you consider just how incompatible Thomas and LEGO seem at first. We haven't really had time for a movie yet this year, so let's spotlight Tram Engine Studios with their original movie Discovery, uploaded on November 6th and centering on Gordon and the Flying Scotsman in another fairly dark narrative. Tram Engine Studios went on to work in so many mediums though, so Discovery only represents a small and fairly early part of their work. A series in a similar style was finally getting off the ground after a winding early production, that being Trains for Days' Sodor Dark Times: A Frenzy Payback. The edgier side of Thomas was still alive and well this year, without going quite as far as Shed 17 had. And with that wrapped up, it's my pleasure to welcome you back to the Honourable Mentions Zone for 2013 to 2016. This period's Honourable Mentions include Sudrian Railway Modeller, Sterling Product 01, Terrence the Tractor 525, Thunderbird Studios, Cyber Rusty 99, The Night Train, NWR 58, the Peel Godred Branch, Bradley the Thomas Fan 1, and many of our previous Honourable Mentions. We've come a long way. 16 years, in fact. I hope you can see that sub-communities and styles of content had really solidified by this point. The prominent ones we've seen so far have been trains creators, physical creators using more technical ranges like Hornby and Bachmann, physical creators using smaller, more accessible merch like Wooden Railway and Trackmaster, music creators, and then some smaller ones like comedy creators and informative creators, analysing and reviewing the show. So let's take a break from the action and look at where some of the channels we've met in the first half of this video were in 2016. So, what have our trains friends been up to while we've been away? One of the first in the business that we met back in 2008 was Shunter Productions, and by 2016 they'd built up a much larger amount of content with two particularly long-running series, 5 seasons of Thomas and Others, alongside the new Railway series, showing that the idea of an extended Railway series canon wasn't something the ERS had a monopoly on. Sodor Island 3D was also still going. By this time its importance had waned a bit because there were now other really high quality models on sites like Sodor Workshops, which had actually formed fairly soon after SI3D. Sodor Railways, the Sudrin Community, Crowens Gate Works, Light and Coal, as well as individuals like Darth Assassin, were some of the other names making routes, locos, rolling stock, whatever demand required, too many to count. SI3D had moved around a couple of websites by now, but it was still quite popular due to the nostalgia that was already growing up behind it. Trains itself had undergone a soft reboot back in 2013 and 2014 entitled Trains: A New Era, which changed the mechanics of the game significantly, but also seemed to have made it a lot more appealing for up-and-coming creators. In 2016, Trains was still the king. Wild Nor'Wester had taken Sodor the early years so far by this point that it became, well, Sodor the modern years, and by the end of 2016, the modern series was most of the way into its second season, and even featured some characters from Tugs within Trains. Likewise, NWR 1991's Northwestern Railway Tales had completed its fifth season and showed no signs of slowing down. T1E2H3 had taken the engines of Sodor to the end of a third season, and although we'll cover a couple of our budding video essayists in a moment, I should mention that he was one of the more popular Thomas review channels at the time. As well as making some banger tunes, Carson Marenka of the Video Workshop was now a well-established Trains creator, but still very focused on remakes. Tyne Senseth was also splitting time between music and Trains, developing Arcane Merchant in the shadows, and contributing plenty to other fan projects. Our final Trains but variety creator is Terrier55 Stepney, who had been busy with some really out-there projects like the pyrotechnic comedy Railway Thieves, alongside wacky train stuff like Train vs Drone, and to be honest, every video on Max's channel is an absolute gem, so check it out. But on that note, let's move on to the creators whose main emphasis was on physical model work, specifically in the more expensive Hornby and Bachmann ranges. Sparkshot, although not producing regular stories anymore, took his channel in the tutorial direction, building local kits and wiring points. Cactus190706 created so many series and specials since we last mentioned him that I can't remotely try to list them all, but one of the larger ones was Sodor and the Lost Branch Line, as well as 5 series of Sodor Railways. DCG-12B had also brought Jimmy the Ginty up to its 40th episode, and although there'd be a couple more episodes very sporadically after this, the main bulk of that series was over. Another sporadic but really great creator is of course ThomasFan247, who began his series of the Northwestern Railway in 2016, and released the 3rd episode in 2025. Part of that, of course, is the insane quality on display here, a quality also exemplified by TARDIS Rescue. When we mentioned TARDIS ages ago, it was as a Trains creator, but more and more this channel was moving over to the physical realm, using probably the best practical effects in the fandom even by 2016. Although he continued working in Trains, TARDIS's modelled content is unlike anything else, and by this point we just had a taster of what was to come. Finally, there's the Creator Collective, which had seen 24 stories, some spread out over multiple episodes, and brought in millions of views to the official channel. I've included this with the quote-unquote technical section because the amount of resources going into it were absolutely insane. That's not to diminish our next category though, because even though the following channels were working with generally cheaper and more accessible merch, they made it go so far. Leo Henry of Leo Kim Video was absolutely pouring out content by now, mostly merch reviews of Thomas stuff and some items from other franchises, the occasional giant cockroach being hoovered up by the Dyson DC59 stick vacuum, the usual. The identity of the Mad Bomber, by the way, was still unknown, but by this point it was clear a sequel wasn't happening. Since Leo Kim Video began with UNTOLD, I think it's only right we go there next. ThomasFan8 had been quiet for years after the Secret Island re-uploads, but as it happens, they came back with a vlog just in time to catch this interval, alongside the Railway Inspector 3. Bram Groot Films was never confined to UNTOLD in the first place, so I don't really know why they're in this section, but they'd been doing a bit of everything. Trains, Bachmann, fandubs, the whole works. Diesel D199 was now firmly in the CGI era of Tomica, really leaning into the parody aspect, including parodies of stories within the fandom, like Timothy and Shed 17. The fact that today D199's channel has over 1 billion views says something about the kind of popularity this series has, and had even in 2016. I haven't run the numbers, but I'm pretty sure it'll be the most viewed series in fandom history. One final merchandise range to go, and it's one of the best, Wooden Railway. Enterprising Engine 93's final episode of 2016 was his 71st as a part of the series' 3rd season. Chivalry is Dead is classic EE93 and shows off the reasons for his popularity really well. Zany, authentic, and just really well made. As well as bigger projects like the Culdee Fell movie, Matt's series holds up to the present day. Thomas Wooden Railway was also forging a path into the future, with 13 seasons of experience behind him, and Milk Tanker Media was gearing up for their Season 3 finale, Never the Same Again. Speaking of which, music would never be the same again with all the Thomas channels now composing it. Tugster was cranking out some sweet vibes, and Sundry and Afro, Upside Now, Toby's Windmill, they were all gaining more attention, of course. Our innocence as impressionable children would also never be the same again, with all the YouTube poops still being produced by Bioko Island Films and The Real Xbox Nerd, among others. As for our informative channels, by 2016 GWR Studios had produced many more goof videos, but also some pretty cool Backman remakes. Smurfy Dan had continued steaming to legacy, covering up to Thomas's fame on TV, but looking to go much further. Although it's a bit of an outlier, over on SIF, the Extended Railway series had reached volume 256, and had been worked on by many contributors. Some of the most regular ones were friendly forum faces like Christopher, Eden, Ian, Ryan, O1 Salty, i.e. Bulgy13 from Thomas Blows His Stack. The list is endless. Well, of course it's not actually endless, but you take my point, okay? Even Simon A.C. Martin from the British Railway Stories got plenty of volumes in. Before we leave the oasis of this interval and once more dive into the sands of time, a quick note on Twitter. By the end of 2016, Twitter had skyrocketed in popularity, and alongside other sites which were much more optimized for quick communication, it allowed easy video sharing, and was likely one factor in the decline of activity on Sodor Island forums over the next years, which is why I brought that up a second ago. That said, SIF still had a dedicated user base, and we'll be seeing some great content from forum regulars over the coming years. And now the curtain rises again. It rises on a very different year from our first act, which began in 2000. Now, in 2017, the world has grown older and maybe a little less wonderful, but Thomas fan content has never been more alive. Restock on your refreshments, and let's go. You've heard of Victor Tanzig's Stories of Sodor. Well, it was on January the 7th, 2017, when a preview dropped for this multi-season series, the inspiration to countless content creators, and one of the most famous series in fandom history. While many of the early episodes were loose Tugs adaptations, the series began to expand into much more original plot lines shortly after. Narrated in a style which I think was one of its main appeals, Stories of Sodor follows the history of the island at a leisurely pace through the timeline. Everything from the intro music to the narration is crafted to give a Tugs vibe with Thomas characters. It's worth saying, as an objective note, that the visual style doesn't change very much from season to season, and this series was never trying to push the envelope with what was possible in trains. The reason Tanzig's work is so popular is because it struck a lot of balances. Spooky sometimes without being Shed 17, gritty without being Dark Times, goofy while not being Transformers. Some of Tanzig's later content would provoke discussion, but the early Stories of Sodor episodes are modern classics. June the 4th saw an updated prologue released for Kane fans' latest project, The Clinchfield Curse. This installment tied an American ghost train into the world of Sodor, and was, in some ways, a lot more inventive than the Timothy stories, despite a bit of a style clash between these railroad giants of the American lines with dinky little Tom Tom the Choo Choo. Once again, this was a project that appealed to the masses, and although it never reached the same heights as Timothy's two sagas, it was more or less Kane's finale to these bigger Thomas projects on his channel. Again, despite some drama surrounding his channel across the years, I'm glad these things were made. A really unique channel around at this time was Crafty Fox, building super impressive replicas of both Thomas characters and real locomotives in Minecraft. Although his most popular videos would be later animation ones, his talent was really on display at this point too. I should also probably mention, before I'm skinned alive, that Roblox content has existed in the fandom for eons, and gave some creators a great entry point into filming their original stories. While a pretty simple medium, let's not discount it. Fandom projects can often surprise you like that. Another good example of this began on August the 3rd this year, when Railfan number 1 began the Tales of the Northwestern Rail series, using take-along and having a feel very reminiscent of older series. Although it might look simplistic, in the future this canon would be given a full series of lore videos and go on for 7 seasons. A nice reminder not to judge a book by its cover. After testing his skills with remakes and music videos, Train's creator Epic Lafito began the Sudrian Stories series, try saying that 10 times fast, on October the 1st, continuing over the following years and seeing a huge hike in quality. Epic Lafito is one channel that shows some insane development technically, and the quality of his latest episodes is something most creators would dream of in feature-length movies. To introduce some glorious confusion, Mr. A the Hedgehog released a pilot to The Adventures on Sodor on Christmas Eve. That means that The Adventures on Sodor, the stories of Sodor, and the Sudrian Stories are all started in the same year. Old habits die hard in this fandom. A super unique project came out on New Year's Eve though, The Journey Beyond Sodor How It Should Have Been production by the JBS Group. The team for this included names like Wooden Railway aficionados Master of the Lemons, Hero the Japanese Train, and Oliver Duck, to name a few. Essentially, this was a reworking of the Journey Beyond Sodor special into a more coherent but still grandiose format, filmed in Wooden Railway and the only video on its channel. I just want to talk about this for a second because I don't think enough people realise how brilliantly restrained this project is. The JBS Group saw a real problem in a very flawed movie, and they worked super hard to fix it, and they fixed it, and that was that. As much as I love the sweeping timelines of fandom series or the epic cinematography of our greatest movies, JBS How It Should Have Been is a different kind of special. It sits alone, there aren't any spin-offs or add-ons. It really is how it should have been with Thomas as a whole, not desperate to force Thomas into any conceivable environment to outcompete its fast-paced competition, but just content with telling good stories. To lower the tone from this ponderous note, listen to this. Kevin Jennison's Ringo rap is one of my favourite original pieces of music from 2017, a callback to the style of the breakfast song in epic fashion. Aside from this, there aren't too many new music channels to mention right now, but there were starting to be a lot more reviews and video essays this year, not really triggered by any one event as far as I can see. Within the world of video essays and reviews, there were a couple of names operating that we're not going to mention quite yet, and you'll see why later. 2017 had also been a year of goodbyes. One of the more prominent departures was that of Miss Oliver and Blossom, who left their classic channel for personal reasons this year. While it's always a sad event to see some of the first creators in the fandom bid adieu, look at this comment section. So many beautiful comments filled with people, now famous in their own right, paying tribute to a creator that inspired them many years before. The now really very popular GWR Studios also posted their last video on November 28th, and then fully switched to their car-centric YouTube channel, Neo Auto, without a word. As if all this wasn't enough, 2018 also began in tragedy. SI3D, that bastion, closed down on January 27th. This was largely due to plagiarism of some of their models, somewhat poetic given why the site had been formed in the first place. A lot of people were devastated and even angry at this, both because of the nostalgia associated with SI3D's models, but also because a lot of the other train sites we mentioned earlier were put under more pressure to deliver, since even in its later years, SI3D had been one of the biggest entry points for many new trains users. If we can take something positive from this though, the closure of SI3D did push more people into creating their own trains material longer term, and it didn't end the fandom's use of trains in any way. Let's lighten up a bit with Hour of Poop's first Thomas-centric YTP, The Train Killers. It is probably the most British piece of media ever produced by this fandom, uploaded appropriately on April the 1st. April was a super busy month actually, and even aside from this parody, it saw two brilliant cinematic projects. Mainland Studios released a sequel to The Adventure Begins, that being The Adventure Continues, makes sense, on April 6th, a fairly simple but really well tied together version of the Railway series books, James the Red Engine and Troublesome Engines. On April 16th, the first episode of the Night Train's The Magic Within series, which had a really ambitious scope and aimed to tie all canons of the series together, was released after quite some time in development. Although a couple of the episodes have a good amount of views, this is still a fairly unknown series and underrated channel on the whole, very high effort. April also saw two new Wooden Railway channels enter the scene. James is Here on April 6th, who would go on to make some really popular shorter content, and on April 21st, a name that many of you will recognise, Crazy Caboose Creations. Although not a very big channel, and maybe not an obvious choice for a timeline, we'll be reflecting on him again shortly, so it seems right to mark the place where his channel began. There's not really a good way to transition from that to this, so let's just say, well, Paul's Vids is back with a sequel to Shed 17. Project G1 was very much of the same don't take it too seriously, oh my goodness that is horrible vibe that its predecessor had, but with much more material and more of an actual story. It was a real upgrade, to be honest, and I have to give it props for completely standing out in an era where lots of Trains content had a similar sort of premise and feel. Still. For a much more normal horror project, though not in a bad way, the channel Narrow Gauge began their series Horrors of the Rails on October 3rd, releasing audio stories weekly in the run-up to Halloween. Although it started very simple, this series would become an annual event, with seasons stretching across 4 years. Audio stories were in no way new, they go back to the earliest days of the fandom, but these ones had a quality to them that inspired a lot of people to emulate them. I also just have a personal fondness for this series, particularly the later seasons. They got me through a pretty rubbish holiday at one point, so thanks for that. On December 18th, Diesel D199 released a compilation video of his shorts. I mean, the short episodes of his series, though I'm sure he has a great taste in shorts as well. I wouldn't normally mention a compilation video like this, but look at that view count, 111 million at the time of writing this script, and perhaps more by the time you're watching this. It goes to show the power of a wide audience and really high quality original content. It's also eerily prophetic in its reflections.
I've got it!
On the 7th of January 2019, Trains 2019 dropped, but the first big Trains project of the year, on January the 1st in fact, was not in Trains 2019 because it didn't need to be. I'm talking about the brilliant movie The Little Westerner by The Scotsman Returns, who we somehow haven't mentioned yet. Scotsman had been making Trains content for years. Their most popular projects before this were Rogue Kipper and Home the Long Way Round, but after a decade of on and off development, The Little Westerner was definitely their greatest achievement, and one of the best movies to ever come out of the fandom. It followed Oliver before the events of the Railway series, and gave him a really compelling backstory. The gritty feel was combined with a pretty unique portrayal of dieselization that perhaps makes this one of the most realistic fan projects ever made, in a strange sort of way. As well as a couple of movies we have yet to see, it joins those upper ranks with the likes of Half Pariah that only gain a new edition once in a blue moon. The Thomas Creator Collective aired its last instalment, Mischief at the Monkey Palace, on March 16th. The Creator Collective had now been going for around 4 years, and came to an end for a few reasons, including burnout from those involved, and increased mandates from Mattel. It's worth remembering we're in the blubber era of the show now, and as a side note, the merchandise being sold is generally hot garbage, so when it comes to physical productions, people are using older items. As is now customary when we reach sad events like this, Hour of Poop sweeps in to save the day with Tovis, which I think is probably the best edited YTP the fandom has ever produced. Although not technically a Thomas creation, Big Engines 87 released the first episode of Modern Railroad on June 15th, which took 4 years to produce due to the hand-sculpted faces for the characters of this lively, back-chatty American railroad. Another brilliantly handcrafted production comes from the Train Modeler this month, with his first high-quality original stories, Thomas and the Seaside Storm, again being uploaded after 3 years of work. Reflect on that for a second. 3 or 4 years of work for these single videos. I've worked on this timeline video for the better part of a year, and even I can't fathom the dedication you need to produce something like these guys have. I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. Also in June, Turtles and Thomas began Turtles Ertles, and I am at least glad that the Ertle range got a bit more time to shine, because by this point it had been largely sidelined in favour of Wooden Railway for these kinds of projects. Let's talk about someone that, once again, many of you will be surprised I haven't mentioned already. Boscher Studios 254 had been on YouTube since 2011, under a number of different channel names. Let's just say that there is so much controversy surrounding this guy that I'd kind of feel better not dwelling on it, but it's worth noting that in 2019 he released the first part of a trilogy involving Alfred, which gained some popularity and justified the next 2 installments. These movies, the new stories of Alfred the Fallen B-12, show that the old OCs were still on the block by this point. They are also fairly well known, partly due to Bosch's infamy, but also because they're some of the most recent long-form content which was using ideas from the original Dark Times canon. Many long-standing series were still using Alfred in very different ways though, such as Stories of Sodor. Another user we should have mentioned earlier, but who was getting really popular with Trackmaster by now, was Sidekick Jason, and I mention him because by this time he has completed a full Trackmaster remake of The Adventure Begins, among many other accomplishments. As well as contributing to the Creator Collective, Jason had made lots of original stories on these wonderful expansive sets. His channel is another mountain of gems, so check it out. Trains for Days' Dark Times series had been making progress for some time by this point, but on December 6th, the first episode received a complete makeover, which brought a lot of new attention to the project. In terms of big videos this December, the other one to mention, which I still revisit from time to time, is Terrier 55 Stepney's hilarious but also technically stunning adaptation of the Polar Express ice drift scene for Thomas. Really funny and a great way to close out what has been a couple of years of soaring highs. Before we head to the honourable mention zone for the second time in these glory days, let's talk music, more specifically Headmaster Hastings. Although very small at this point, Headmaster Hastings was getting going on YouTube, covering Thomas themes in a range of styles. The man behind the channel, Jackson Begley, would more famously go on to do the most amazingly crisp vocal covers of the show's songs, and become one of the best known music artists in the fandom. There were others though, and Arcade Productions is another great singer-songwriter who got a lot of attention at this time. Welcome back to the honourable mention zone, which is now severely inflated. What I mean by that is that in the earlier sections of this video, the people in this section were really great, but weren't necessarily as active or influential as the folks in the main timeline. By now though, we could have whole paragraphs of script dedicated to some of the following creators: Sam the Train Fan, Thomas the Model Adventures, Mr. Bluebell Engine, Thomas and Pokemon Fan 1997, Tenshine 1 Productions, Train Dude 456, Ryan Sock, Demon of Nowhere, and many of our previous honourable mentions. Well, that was a slightly shorter section. I feel we really kept the pace up well there. What? Sorry, what was that? Oh no. 2020 changed the world forever, and it was around March when many nations began their lockdowns due to COVID-19. These lockdowns meant more time at home, and as a result, a lot more time to make stuff. From April or so, there was an explosion of Thomas content. Of course though, a lot of content that came out during these months had already been in the works long before COVID. Let's look at one of those now. Remember the Extended Railway series? Well, on April 17th, the channel Rider Ronan, an insane repository of talent, released a teaser for their adaptation of the seminal ERS volume, Edward's Branch Line. ERS adaptations had been done before by all sorts of creators, many in audio format, but this was bigger. The first episode was released on May the 1st, and the subsequent adaptations of the volume drew even more attention to it. It wouldn't be the last ERS book to be adapted by Rider Ronan either. May 12th was also the new April Fools this year, because Sodor's NWR Steam definitely made a lot of people think that the 1953 Sad Story of Henry adaptation, a piece of lost media, had resurfaced. Even though the description of this found footage style video clearly says it's a fake, I still can't quite believe that. It was a brilliant recreation of what might have been, by a creator who, both with this and the NWR Stories series, has done some of the fandom's best handcrafted videos. Both Rider Ronan and Sodor's NWR Steam were great at getting a really strong tone across in their work, and in July, one of our old honourable mentions, Thunderbird Studios, also did just that. On July 4th, Thunderbird released an hour-long adaptation of Duke the Lost Engine, a really heartfelt one. It captured the tone of the Railway series volume perfectly, and is still probably the single best Railway series adaptation in my books. For a slightly less lore-accurate project, but something that everyone in the fandom will expect to be on here, here's one of the biggest achievements in our history, which premiered on August 25th, 2020, after more than 4 years of production. Mr. Conductor Fan 1406, real name Nicky, had this passion project, a full parody of Thomas and the Magic Railroad, which is probably the most parodiable movie of all time. It sounds like a goofy idea that probably wouldn't be very high quality, but if you watch the 3-hour movie, which blends intricate wooden railway work and live-action filming, you'll find yourself proved wrong very quickly. The cast is stacked, the humour lands, the more serious moments are impactful too. When I asked my audience what they thought the most influential and important fan projects of all time were, this was probably the single most mentioned project alongside Mad Bomber and Tynes' stuff. Part of why I find this project so amazing is how it incorporates so many genres without feeling jarring. It has a charm to it because it takes not taking itself seriously very seriously. The assembly cut of this movie was over 4 hours long, and that alone speaks to the scope and sheer amazement factor this project has. I think there are projects with better scripts on this timeline, but this is perhaps the most impressive overall. The lockdown years did great things for video essays. Trainboy, not to be confused with 54, dropped his first video on September 15th, and went on to do a lot of varied content, including historical videos on the show's props, merchandise reviews, and the odd video essay. Trainboy's content went from strength to strength, and was one channel that helped me and many others get through a difficult few months. There was another too, one you'll have heard of, The Unlucky Tug. Some of you will be very surprised that I haven't mentioned Nick of The Unlucky Tug before this point, since he's the most well-known essayist in the fandom by a long shot. Before 2020, Tug did already have a following, and older videos like Unanswerable Thomas Questions were really popular. But on September 18th, he came out of a hiatus with an extensive video essay laying into Bubba with pure style. This was really what kick-started the era of his channel's fame, and lots more video essays would follow it. Some were shorter, delving into why Thomas was much more than a simple kids show. Others were longer, to say the least, but even more engaging. The quality on display here, particularly of later series like Sodor's Finest, which has featured actual voice actors from the show, by the way, is awe-inspiring, and also me-inspiring. Along with a couple of others, Tug's content was one of the biggest inspirations for my channel, and if I've made content 1% as good as his by the end of my time here, I count that as a win. We'll be coming back to Tug in the next section, but let's switch our focus to the horror stories of the fandom for the time being. Although it began on Wattpad, Tidmouth Thunderbolt's series Sodor Fallout released a prologue on YouTube on October 28th. Now again, Thunderbolt is an individual who will not be going over in much detail, but we'll just focus on the project itself. Sodor Fallout's premise was very simple. Thomas goes nuclear. While the core outline of the story originated with Thunderbolt, many channels like Percy and the Beast Productions and others acted as torchbearers for this concept, forming their own takes on what this deformed, irradiated version of Sodor would look like. Fallout was a bit of a horror craze, kind of like Shed 17, but with, frankly, much less of a story. The horrors of Horn Lake saga, begun by the Blue Snowplow just 2 days later on October 30th with Monster Under the Shed, is a different beast, however. This pretty simple opening grew into a 5-part masterpiece, with every episode improving on the one before. Featured talents included familiar names like Enterprising Engine 93 and Tyne Senseth, but it was the Blue Snowplow who brought it all together. This series is so atmospheric, and is the definitive modern Thomas horror production in my opinion. This is another project I could spend an hour unpacking, so let's move on before I get dragged in. Another creator with a huge body of work is Shunter Productions, one of the first Trains creators we looked at in 2008. If you compare Ghosts of Sodor Revised, a video from November 2020, with one of their first creations, it becomes so obvious how far Trains has come in that time frame. Shunter Productions had also come a long way too, but had stuck with the faint horror genre and its plentiful opportunities for stories. With all of this considered, Fallout, Horn Lake, Shunter, it becomes clear that fandom horror and edginess had moved way past Shed 17 by this point. These stories feature much less interaction with the real world, except perhaps Sodor Fallout, and are much more about the supernatural or mystical forces on the island itself. But, oh, look at that! I was just starting to worry that Tobias and the Arcane Merchant wouldn't be coming out at all, but it's Christmas Day and a second trailer just dropped. It won't be long now, let's go. I think 2020 can be summed up with just one music video, made in that year. The Tugster Intensifies and Headmaster Hastings collab that was the Break My Stride cover. Some see it as the anthem of the fandom, but more than that, it was so fitting for 2020. Lockdown hadn't stopped the community, but had given it the resources to grow itself. COVID-19 hadn't broken our stride quite yet. But would it next year? Well, 2021 did begin with a bit of a stink bomb, in that, you know, the show died. The final episode of the show's last season aired on the 20th of January and gave way to the All Engines Go reboot we all know and loathe. Would this break our stride? Well, no. All this meant was that in terms of chances for proper stories, the torch had been passed to fan content entirely. It was, in a way, a very exciting opportunity, and the new content we saw in 2021 made the most of it. It was at this time we saw some channels transitioning into different styles of content. TARDIS Rescue was somehow still improving his physical craft with The Beginning of the End, released on January 9th, but whereas he had moved from trains into model work, the opposite was true of DCG 12B. DCG set up a trains channel this year, having moved away from Jimmy the Ginty to make some equally amazing stories set on Sodor. Thomas Fan 2002 was also a channel that had made some popular stuff before this point, but their really big break came from January 22nd onwards, with the series Tracks to Big Adventures. This was sort of Bwubba how it should have been, using ideas from The Unlucky Tug and others to give that final disappointing era of Thomas a fresh feel. Speaking of giving past stories a makeover, Sooty Will's Back on Track series began in February, adapting magazine stories on a level that magazine stories had never seen before, complete with behind-the-scenes deep dives. On March the 13th, Luke Ryan of the channel Explosive Cookie dropped a really exciting mini-documentary revealing a ton of new information about Audrey's Mid-Sodor railway layout. I would actually say this is one of the most important videos of the year, because it was full of genuine answers to questions that had plagued the community for ages. We finally learnt a canonical roster for this mysterious railway, complete with entire engines we'd previously only seen in blurred photos. This theme of layouts gives us a nice transition back to the Unlucky Tug, who was beginning a new series called Tug's Trains, adding yet another member to the fandom's army of modelers. Right at the end of the year, Tug would also release a video about the Miller era, and it was dedicated to somebody very special. On April 18th, Peter of Crazy Caboose Creations, aged just 16, tragically passed away as a result of complications during heart surgery. Peter's loss was really mourned, and although he's not the only fandom member we've lost over the years, both his age and the fact that he was so well liked by many made this sting even more. He had made plans for some YouTube projects before his passing, but sadly, these were never to be. I didn't know him personally, but it's clear that he was a big loss, and he won't be forgotten. Despite this grief, 2021 should not be remembered only as a sad year. Tons more brilliant stuff was still to come in the middle of the year, not least a video by tons of Trackmasters on May 22nd. Now, why was this random 30-second clip so special? It wasn't, actually, although Tons of Trackmasters is another great channel focused on merchandise. What was special here was a comment, out of the blue, by one Leo Kim video, revealing the identity of the Mad Bomber. 21 years after Leo Henry began work on that amazing project which began our timeline, we learnt who his culprit was. It was Bluebell. Bluebell hadn't appeared in the actual project, but was an Ertl toy of the real-life locomotive who was featured briefly in the Railway series. Hints spread throughout the trailers such as,
"He looks just like you,"
subtly pointed to the bomber's identity in being the same Ertl design as Thomas. First Luke Ryan's Mid-Sodor work, and now this. These couple of months were an exciting time. Another exciting development was something happening on the music scene. Normally I would go over a year's music in retrospect, but this entry from Upside Now has to be included in the main timeline because it's probably the biggest single music project in the history of the fandom. I'm talking about Thomas Reorchestrated, a Sodor symphony. After a mountain of work and a crowdfunding campaign, Nathan released this symphony to YouTube publicly on June 9th. It consisted of 28 classic themes, mostly Season 1 material, covered in a grand orchestral style. We haven't seen much groundbreaking wooden railway work since the Magic Railroad parody, so let's take a moment to appreciate Master of the Lemon's mini-film A Salty Story, beautifully shot with that handcrafted look, which released in July. While we mentioned Lemons as part of the JBS project, we haven't given him enough attention for the amazing creator he is. A Salty Story marked a bit of a shift to longer content, which we'll be seeing a bit more of later. This August, Thomas fans descended on the Talyllyn Railway in Wales for the first ever Audrey extravaganza, organised by the railway and featuring exhibitions, special trains and so much more. This would become a recurring event, and we can't cover it every year, so suffice to say it was always a great thing to watch vlogs and videos of the extravaganza even when I couldn't attend in person. While the extravaganza was never quite a convention, it was a great way to bring together fans, even virtually during COVID. It also heralded more Thomas content from those involved with the Talyllyn, including Tim Dunn, who delivered one of Audrey's lectures on the history of Sodor at the end of this year. This lecture wasn't the last of its kind either, and brought even more tidbits of lore to the surface. What else is there to say about the back end of 21? Carson's Video Workshop dropped a very popular remaster of his Richard the New Engine series from a couple of years back, Richard being another OC along with the likes of Dudley to gain more prominence in recent years and steal much of the limelight from Alfred, Timothy and the older crowd. Other formats were also thriving this year. YTPs were safe and sound in the hands of channels like the Thomas and Tugs Man, and Sodor Island models mixed informative and speculative content with digital edits. While not a remotely YouTube-specific thing, photoshopping and touching up illustrations or stills from the show for the purposes of headcanon or just for fun was also a really common thing by this point. The first half of 2022 was, all things considered, fairly normal. Lots of smaller creators were working away diligently due to having so much lockdown time, as we mentioned, and so there were a lot of growing fan bases at this time. One of the bigger projects, though, was the Henry movie, by the channel then called Mr. Ryan, later Cosmic. Although he's another character surrounded by a bit of drama, the movie itself picked up a good amount of traction, made with motor, road and rail, and detailing Henry's origins. Rydai Ronan also returned on July 1st with the first episode of their next ERS adaptation, Blowback, the first story in the volume Express Engines. A huge step up from Edward's branchline, Express Engines was a roaring success, and would be followed by many shorter but visually spectacular projects from this guy in the following years. Although in some ways this isn't a piece of fan content, I have to mention the work of Thomas Tankmurch and others in bringing behind-the-scenes footage to light this year, most significantly with hours of Season 5's behind-the-scenes tapes, including B-roll, bloopers and alternate shots. The preservation side of the community is again hugely underrepresented in this timeline, and if I felt I could extend the video to 4 hours, then we'd be covering them in much more detail. This year was a smaller one for horror content than 2020 had been, but wasn't without its contributions. Trains horror was a well-established subgenre by this point, due to the work of channels like Reneus Productions, but one of the more extended, continuous series in this vein was Daylight 3's Forest Horrors series, beginning on October 2nd. Now, it's no Hoenn Lake, which by this time had aired its fourth and penultimate instalment, but Forest Horrors still has an underlying atmosphere of melancholic tension, setting it apart from others like it. Although it's somewhat of a one-off, the Bogey Boys train story The Half Engine was also really popular, premiering on November the 1st. Audio horror was still alive too though, particularly through Master of the Lemon's epic audio productions, notably The Token, which is over an hour and a half long. As if this wasn't enough, just a couple of months later, on November 11th, his next audio story would drop. And, oh, it's almost 3 hours long. Despite the length of these pieces, they do hold the attention remarkably well, and to me represent the peak of the fandom's work in this format. Over these years, with more channels beginning to develop quickly during lockdown, there were fewer single huge influences on the fandom, and the popularity of projects was generally a bit more shared out. The one exception to that rule would be Project Tiger Moth, which was absolutely huge for some time after its release on November 27th. Project Tiger Moth was the name given to the production of a full classic series style episode called The Good Old Days, in the correct scale, with scratch-built sets and an original score. Led by Flying Pringle, the team behind this spent over 2 years producing it, and while the view count isn't necessarily much bigger than some of the projects we've discussed so far for this year, the influence it had was huge, and it was a real ray of hope as we left lockdown. It even inspired video essays of its own, including by Usual Bloke Luke, one of our growing video essay channels at the time. Another truly amazing thing about Project Tiger Moth is that it didn't turn a profit and wasn't even monetized. All that work on the Gauge 1 sets and the script and everything was done for pure love of the craft. The amount of effort that went into this also shines a light on just how amazing the classic seasons of the original show are, and as soon as a project does that, it's a great one in my books. Flying Pringle also gave us this gem.
Action, Toby, full speed.
Go, 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 go,
You can do it, you can do it!
We'll end these lockdown years with an entry from I Love Trains 323, their most popular movie to date, Defenders of Sodor. Released on December 2nd, it was just one piece of evidence that the tradition of fandom movies featuring improbable situations was alive and well. As we'll see, this tradition would actually reach new heights in the couple of years ahead. That said, don't we have somewhere to be? That's right, welcome back to the Honourable Mentions Zone. I'm just realising now that that title might sound a little patronising, but I swear these guys are genuinely all great creators. Our honourable mentions for 2020 through 2022 are as follows: Silver Band, Carnforth Ginty, TARDIS9, Sudrian Steam, LL Company, Oliver 11 GWR, Brendan Productions, Longtime Writer The Buried Truck, and many of our previous honourable mentions. Well, just one more section to go. We're now in the modern era, stuff that even recent fandom arrivals will remember. The future is on our doorstep, so let's finish this. After the bulk of lockdowns had ended, we began to see more of the big, singular projects taking centre stage again. Although the first couple of months passed largely without incident, on March the 1st, 2023, an episode was uploaded by a guy called Trampy, who we mentioned earlier under the name Big Engines 87, entitled Trampy Movie 1, Edward. Trampy's mini-movies, which developed in complexity and length over time while retaining a really very simple format, were so popular that they spawned numerous adaptations and a dedicated following. They're both hilarious and also so genuine that you can't not love them. Although they were audio productions, they were totally different from what came before, relying on the characters themselves rather than a narrator. They were also so realistic, not because they went ham on real railway practices, but because they treated these engines like actual colleagues, co-workers, real people, something that not a lot of fan productions do. At the time I'm writing this, there are now 17 of these, with the longest being nearly half an hour. Trampy is a good friend of one unlucky Tug, and we'll return to him now for a bit of a downer. On March 20th, a blank channel called The Unlucky Tug uploaded a video simply titled, "Well, this sucks." After gaining hundreds of thousands of subscribers and making YouTube a full-time career, Tug's channel was terminated shortly before this due to a copyright technicality that wasn't even the fault of his channel. For some creators, this would have been the end, but not for Tug. While there was a brief hope that the original channel might be reinstated, as it became clear it wasn't happening, Tug grit his teeth, re-uploaded much of his recent content, and bounced back. The community rallied around him, and he simply didn't stop putting out new content. In only a few weeks he turned the tables and, while at a much lower subscriber count, was beginning to rise out of the pit YouTube had dug for him. Throughout 2023, there were a few new, if fairly underground, UNTOLD productions which are always fun to see. Famous Engines, although not particularly well known, was leaning into this style beautifully, and on a slightly bigger scale, the appropriately named Thomas and Friends UNTOLD Adventures released the movie The Rise of Spamcan in May. The reason I mention this is because it was one of the first big UNTOLD productions in a while, and I also feel a real attachment to UNTOLD because it was the range that started this whole timeline off, and so it's great to see it's still being used in the present day. Speaking of merchandise, on June 17th, Tons of Trackmasters began his Evolution of Trackmaster series, which offered a really nice look back over how the range had developed, pretty much across the timeline we've constructed today. HO00 modelling was also doing well, and on August 12th, Thomas the Tank Man 111 released a video covering one of the most impressive Thomas layouts ever made in it, Terence the Tractor 525's masterpiece. Other modelers, like the Train Modeler, were also honing their craft even further at this time, with customs and models and sets that make the eyes pop out. Another of this year's big flagship projects marks our return to trains in September, through the Dudley series by Carston's Video Workshop, adapting stories previously written by The Buried Truck in his now signature style. Carston now has a full-on team behind him, by the way, including DCG-12B on the narration. There are lots of Dudley adaptations out there, and many others are impressive too, but this to my mind is the best. There was another, even bigger project reaching the end of its development at this time though, and that was Brannon Carty's documentary, An Unlikely Fandom. The final trailer dropped on October 28th, and was debuted on November 27th in a dedicated screening in New York City. Focusing on Thomas's impact on adult fans across the world, this documentary was like nothing we'd ever seen before. Carty is an expert when it comes to interviews and documentary filmmaking in general, so the end result was an insanely high-quality product, perhaps the most professional piece on this timeline. It made it onto the news, Britt Allcroft saw it and the impact she had had on so many shortly before her passing, and it was an all-round 10 out of 10 success. What made it all the more amazing was that it was crowdfunded to the tune of $14,500 by fans themselves in only a month. Carty and his team are still working on distribution, but there are hopes of a home media release by the end of 2025. Winwatch98, a trains creator who had already been dabbling in the experimental side of trains, was another creator to keep an eye on generally around this time, and videos like his later work Bunker Down helped get Winwatch known as one of the best modern trains creators in terms of insanely high quality visuals, alongside Ryder Ronan and the like. Wardleton Productions was also making a lot of Season 1 style content around this time, really succeeding in capturing the feel of that era of the show. We've talked about the Unlucky Tug already, but 2023 saw another big video essayist get a real boost in subs, that being The Thomas Theorist, with ranking videos and explorations of the show's history. Other channels like Usual Bloke Luke and The Doctor were also contributing to this field. Useful Edward Fan released a Bill Wirtz-style video, The Entire History of Thomas, I guess, and would go on to produce extended series about the show's merchandise and goofs. TTTE Guy, although popular for a good while before this, was taking messing around to new heights, with lots of comedy shorts and merch... well, not merch reviews, more murder, really. On that cheery note, let's move on to the next year. 2024, along with 2016 and a couple of the earlier years, is one of the best on the timeline in my opinion. The creativity and experimentation, but also the honour shown to the franchise's roots, has never been higher than in these recent months. Starting again in March, on March 2nd, Wilbur P. YouTube released Worth It, a simultaneously cinematic and deeply emotional conversation scene between Henry and the Fat Controller that grabs the attention and refuses to let it go, despite the very simple premise. Wilbur's work often features these wonderful custom faces and detailed sets, and his work in Wooden Railway also led to some of the best remakes in fandom history, I think. A somewhat hidden gem. A series that had been going on for a few years, but got a lot more attention this year, as well as some remasters of its older episodes, was The Tedious Tales of Sodor by Biscuit Crew Productions, an unsettling but side-splittingly funny alternate universe combining comedy with a vague feel of analog horror.
I am the breakdown.
May was a busier month, not least because of Bulgy 13's tribute to Thomas Blows' Stack, now 17 years old. I mean, 17 years old. That's insane. A few days later, on May 9th, Terrier 55 Stepney also began releasing his Clever Little Engine series, centering on Ivo Hugh, a character that has been really popular for original stories across the years due to being an absolute blank slate. This series is Terrier's best work to date in my opinion, and another amazing physical contribution to his body of work. And then a couple of days after that, Demon of Nowhere, another great creator who we haven't had enough time to really talk about, released Indignation Meeting 79, which almost killed me the first time I watched it.
Stupid old trams like you don't deserve dreams.
These last few projects, aside from perhaps Terrier's Ivo series, were surprising, and they show that fan content had by no means fallen into a rut by this point. Of course, there are lots of channels doing formulaic content by this time. I'm not trying to suggest that we're all saints of creativity or something, but I can't stress enough that to be surprised by what's in your recommendations from a fandom that has existed for over 20 years is quite something. We mentioned analog horror a second ago, and other whole veins of content were only just beginning to be tapped. Things like ASMR, which accounts for a really small amount of fandom creation, but just wasn't really a thing a few years back. There may be whole other content genres out there for you to find and pioneer. On perhaps a more regular note, a big project this year was Giano Art 06's pilot episode to their Thrills on Rails series. A pilot which is half an hour long is impressive by itself, but when you get Carson commenting that it's amazing, you know you've done a good job. Cool and Quarrels was indeed one of the best Trains episodes in some time, and as with Thomas Fan 2002's project, it really went for the vibe of modern Thomas but without all the nonsense. The varied soundtrack scored by the episode's creator was also a huge highlight. But let's just head to Christmas straight away, because the Christmas holidays of 2024 were the best holidays for any Thomas fan ever. On Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, respectively, we got 2 projects. Although it's out of sequence, I'm going to talk about the project on the 25th first, because it's not quite as big, although it is still stunning. It's another Carson installment, this time titled The Jury. The Jury takes the simple format of a vote and makes it so engaging. Combining elements from Day of the Diesels with a really heartfelt story and a degree of closure to Duck and Diesel's conflict, The Jury was such a satisfying Christmas watch. The only thing that could compare with it was what dropped a day before, on Christmas Eve. After 10 years of waiting, 4 trailers, multiple sneak peeks, and a whole lot of fan theorising, Tyne Senseth gave us Tobias and the Arcane Merchant. I made a review of this movie that's fairly long itself, so let's just start by saying it is amazing, in such a different way to The Jury. This is the consummate take Thomas in a wild direction movie, but it never feels stupid. Arcane Merchant's strength is not just in the fully original score, the nuanced voice acting, or the mind-boggling visuals. Its strength is in the fact that the script takes itself fully seriously. It's almost an anti-Shed 17 in that regard. This was always Tynes' strength right back from the earlier videos, which aren't as accomplished technically. Whereas Shed 17 revels in ironic gore and just being scarringly ridiculous, the Tobias movies revelled in deep and twisting plotlines with characters who felt more Shakespearean than any others that the fandom has written for. So 2 of the most influential fan projects ever, while both doing weird stuff with Thomas characters, are kind of polar opposites when you think about it. I won't talk about Arcane Merchants much longer, you should just go and watch it, and then watch my review please. I need more ad revenue to justify the amount of time that this video took to make. I jest. But with that out of the way, it's on to the most present part of the present day. The year of our Lord 2025. On New Year's Day, Vincente 22's Bad Influence released, a compelling look at multiple influences on various characters. This was one of, if not the, finest wooden railway productions ever made. Just look at some of these shots. It's an incredibly obvious point which has been true all the way since Mad Bomber, but this is just amazing art. There's nothing toned down about it because it's Thomas. Vincente is not just some guy who plays with toy trains, he's a filmmaker who has used toy trains to enhance a story. The fact it's about Thomas is actually an incentive to put even more effort into these original creations, because they're building on something with a heritage, with a legacy that we can become part of. There were a few amazing announcements from the likes of Tyne Senseth and Paul's vids over the next couple of weeks, but we'll leave those until a little later and move on to T1E2H3's Search for Smudger Remaster, which sets a gold standard for how remasters of old projects should be done. One of the key highlights for me was the brilliant voice acting, and also just the huge improvements it made on the original. Our final big project in early 2025 though is a real outlier, and something we haven't talked about much before. Art. The channel Rexeljet, which had been around from the earliest days, began a series about now after a pretty decent YouTube hiatus, drawing background or obscure characters from the Railway series. These drawings were simply amazing, and they kind of showcase another regret of mine, that so much of this fandom's insanely amazing art is never posted on YouTube and falls outside the purview of this video. Just take a look through the SIF art thread, or browse Twitter for fan-made illustrations, and you'll see exactly what I mean. Rexeljet is stunning, but also just the tip of a very talented iceberg. And I have to leave it there, without having covered very much of 2025 at all. You see, I'm finishing this section of the script at 8 AM on Monday the 21st of April 2025, and as of yet, time travel has not been invented. But to leave the video here would be really unsatisfying, so I think it's only right we briefly look back at how some of the channels we met are doing today, just like we did at the end of 2016. I'll see you in the next section for that, and for now, here's our final honourable mentions zone for 2023 through 25. Our honourable mentions for these years are Unlucky's Productions, Tank Engine John John, Broken Wall, Dumb Shuck, Percy 6 Miles, the Jam Tram, Gordon Pacific 04, and many of our previous honourable mentions. And me. Look at that. This is our history. Not perfectly told, but our history nonetheless. As promised, let's begin our final section with a recap of what's happened since 2016 and the present day situations of many friendly faces we've met in the meantime. As I write this, Victor Tanzig has continued Stories of Sodor to a 6th season, and has also branched out into shorts and parody content. The Stories of Sodor universe is certainly bigger than when it began, and the same can be said of Epic Laffiteau's creations. These include 3 seasons worth of increasingly high quality episodes, a handful of specials, and an RWS-style series around original character Larry. Many of these projects were co-written by the wonderful Chase Theed, who also worked on the final part of the Blue Snowplow's Horn Lake series. Speaking of, Snowplow has now completed his epic pentalogy and has released a full movie version with extended material for channel members, as well as the full soundtrack on Spotify. Writer Ronan has been releasing the most beautiful short videos, and the same beauty is present in the later creations of Tram Engine Studios. Tram Engine Studios is now on leave from their channel indefinitely, but is pretty underrepresented on this timeline. Another underrepresented user is the fantastic Mr. S, not a household name, but a really dedicated storyteller and voice actor, who was just released at the 100th episode of a Train series that started 14 years ago. As well as remastering old episodes, Trains for Days has taken their Dark Times canon to 9 installments, some being around an hour in length. Biscuit Crew Productions have also constructed an elaborate timeline for the tedious tales of Sodor, with shorts and full episodes woven together in a really fun structure. Returning to some of the Trains names we discussed in this video's interval, you'll be pleased to know that Shunter Productions still hasn't stopped, collabing with lots of faces like DCG-12B, The Fantastic Mr. S, The Buried Truck of course, and more to create a wealth of horror and non-horror content. Wild Nor'Wester, as well as 5 seasons of the old Early Years series, has determinedly produced 2 more of the modern years and a mini-series featuring OCs like Adeline the Phantom Engine and Rowan the Garrett Engine. NWR 1991 is in their 14th season of stories and has also begun a flashback series, while T1E2H3 has persisted in being awesome with new vlogs, ranking videos, and even a detailed history of their own channel. We covered Carson and Tynes quite a lot in the previous section, so we're largely up to date with them. Instead, let's move on to the physical stuff, with the more technical merchandise once again. TARDIS Rescue is, by their own admission, still kicking. Newer episodes like Just So, and especially Thomas's Cancelled Christmas, blend animation and models seamlessly, accompanied by Knapford Harbour's brilliant scores. I'm not going to do a top 10 creators kind of thing at the end of this, I think that would defeat the point of the video, but if I was, TARDIS would be on there for me. The Train Modeler has released myriads of scene creations and short videos in HO00, as well as a really great video essay on the magic of Thomas itself. Caleb Train is working on similar sorts of projects, and when he's not modelling, he's making Magic Railroad work, as, you know, a functional movie. Finally, there's Terrier55 Stepney, who has largely moved away from trains by this point, and as well as the stunning model work we've already mentioned, he's been working on the Guide Rail series, explaining the reality of British steam, alongside slice-of-life vlogs that are some of the best in the fandom. The advantage of simpler merchandise ranges is that you can make them do more, and that's exactly what Sidekick Jason has been doing. Despite a bit of a hiatus after some impressive work, including interviewing Mike O'Donnell of the original show, we have it on his own authority that he's still working away on Season 3 of his original stories, and he's dropped some new content for the 80th anniversary of the books, something that binds a lot of these channels together. Mr. Conductor Fan 1406 has since transferred to their filmmaking channel, Mad Frog Films, but not before leaving us with a full assembly cut of the Magic Railroad parody. Diesel D199, although uploading a bit less frequently nowadays, has absolutely smashed through 1 million subs and continues CGI work on the Tomica series. Our final stop in this section though is Wooden Railway, 2 channels in particular. When it comes to output, there's basically no one to match Thomas Wooden Railway, now doing videos on the history of wooden character items and factory errors, having moved away from original stories after the 18th season of their series, and after that long of a run, I say, fair enough. Enterprising Engine 9.3 also uploads original stories quite sporadically, but when he does, oh boy are they a treat. As well as doing a ton of great work on his Season 0, a bunch of episodes which move fluidly around the Enterprising timeline, one of Matt's latest productions, Shell on Wheels, provides a beautiful segue into our next section, because it features none other than Headmaster Hastings. Again, Hastings has taken the odd hiatus over the years, but always returns with more musical talent. As well as the most brilliant vocal work, recently we've seen him branching into mixing Thomas with classical music and fairground organs? It's great. The Tugster Intensifies is now one-tram band, and when it comes to arrangements of the show's themes, hundreds of composers have been able to follow in their footsteps. Mavis M and Upside Now both have channels that are pretty quiet right now, but all of these creators have contributed so much to the fandom. Some, like SA Music, have also really made a push to get their original tunes away from Thomas recognised, and they're definitely worth a listen. Finally, we have the Miscellaneous section, which is kind of an unfortunate title, because many of these categories do deserve entire videos to themselves. I would argue that the golden age of the YouTube poop is over, but ideas like the 20-minute YTP challenge and others have at least kept the genre kicking for those who enjoy it. Other generally humorous channels are still going strong, like the aforementioned James Is Here and TTTE Guy. On the video essay front, we have so much to be thankful for. The Unlucky Tug is of course unparalleled, with series like the Thomas Retrospective and Sodor's Finest going from strength to strength, as well as plenty of informative videos on Sodor's timelines, maps, and inspirations. Smurfy Dan kept Steaming to Legacy going for 8 installments, and the Thomas Theorist and others are always quick to deliver quality video essays like Every Bert in Thomas Ranked. Seriously though, it's great to see talented and opinionated people like Theorist explode in popularity. Beyond the screen, the Audrey Extravaganza has now had 5 outings, including diorama competitions, interviews with familiar faces, and a spirit that really shows us as a community, not just as an online group. The Extended Railway series is still going to this day, and SIF is still a great corner for fandom chats and sharing our creations. To end where we began, as we've already mentioned, Leo has revealed our Mad Bomber. Gotta give it to Bluebell, he fooled us. And that's the roundup. As always, there are hundreds more channels we could have checked back in on, and this is only a sliver of even the largest creators in the fandom. If you've watched this far, you are in need of a break, perhaps, so I'll keep my philosophical rambling, which I've tagged on the end of this video, as short as I can. The main point of this section is to reiterate that disclaimer at the beginning of the video. This timeline will go out of date. In fact, it already is out of date by the time of this release, because it's taken so much time to write and produce that new projects will already have emerged. As I write this script, the following are just some of the upcoming projects that I'm personally looking forward to. One that is probably releasing as I'm recording this and will be several months old by the time this video is released is Bulgy 13's short Thomas Blows His Stack sequel, Thomas Comes Back. A proper re-termination of the original is still on the way though. Time Senseth recently announced a third and final movie in his Tobias and the Sentinels trilogy, as it's now called, which will be Tobias and the Birch Cathedral. I went over some theories for that in my Arcane Merchant review, and I'm sure it will be an amazing finale to Toby's story, assuming that I live to see it. Paul's Vids has also announced a third movie in the Shed 17 series, which will be interesting. It turns out Carson's Video Workshop has been cooking up a new series called The Forgotten Engines for almost 5 years, which has begun releasing as I edit this script and promises some brilliant future episodes. On a slightly smaller scale, Simon A.C. Martin has teased an upcoming 19th episode for the British Railway Stories, about 13 years after the last one. And finally, the iOS project is a great ongoing initiative focused on completing a full map of the island of Sodor for trains, building on the work of SI3D. While not a trains user myself, this is going to be amazing for so many creators, and it looks stunning in the trailer. There are way more things I could mention, and definitely some stuff we've been waiting for that I've forgotten and am now kicking myself over in post-production, but frankly, I think we've gone on long enough now. So, thank you for watching. This video is dedicated to you, our unlikely fandom. Now, this online community place sucks occasionally, and I'm very glad I don't have Twitter right now, but the bickering and drama is, for the most part, so forgettable when we see all the things we've done. At the risk of sounding overly sentimental, it has been one of the greatest honours in my life so far to work with and to be friends with so many members of this community. Dry rails and a good running to you all. Now let those credits roll.